Within the last hour, the Israeli government has confirmed it's sending ground troops into the Gaza Strip. It's the latest escalation in 10 days of violence, which has seen one Israeli killed in a Hamas rocket attack and over 240 Palestinians killed by the Israelis. In a moment, we'll be discussing the latest developments, but first, this report by Barry Cummins. Viewers may find some of the images in this report disturbing.
The 4 Bahir boys were laid to rest today, 24 hours after Israeli shelling took their lives on the beach in Gaza City. In the last 10 days, over 220 people have been killed by Israeli airstrikes in Gaza, and one Israeli has died in a Hamas attack. But the deaths of Mohammed, Ismail, Zakaria and Ahed Bahir, children not even yet teenagers, has brought a particular international focus to what is happening in this small part of the world. Gaza is a small, densely populated strip of land with a bloody and complicated history. Over 1.6 million people live in this section of land, which would approximately cover the equivalent of this much of County Dublin.
I have 4 brothers in Gaza and 5 sisters, and my parents as well, and their children. I have friends as well. One of them was killed by an Israeli airstrike. That was shocking to me. He was a taxi driver, and his car was targeted by the Israeli army. He wasn't involved in Hamas, he wasn't carrying any guns, and yet he was attacked. The attacks on civilians and on the people of Gaza have to stop, because these are war crimes.
Israel, meanwhile, says close to 1,500 rockets have been fired by Hamas from the Gaza Strip into Israel in the last 10 days. But it's the killing by Israel of over 220 people in Gaza, including the 4 boys yesterday, that is causing most international upset.
Personally, it's terrible. I mean, I'm a father I also have children, and that's the worst thing that can happen to parents, to lose their children. But we have to understand why it happened.
How could 4 children be confused with anything other than 4 children on a beach?
Were you ever involved in a battlefield?
No.
You're lucky. In the battlefield, you don't always see what's there. You make confusions. This is what it means to be in a war. And again, they might be that there was a mistake there, and the army will check itself. The Israeli army is probably the only army in the world, and in my opinion, the one with the highest standards of moral, that calls people and send leaflets and tell them, look, we are going to bombard this area or this house, stay away as much as you can.
80% of the victims of the attacks, of the Israeli attacks on Gaza, are children and women. This is what the UN is saying. It's not me saying, it's not Israel saying, that's the UN as an internationally credible organization. That's number one. Number two, I think we have to consider here evidence. Yes, we hear Israeli speakers on the news saying all the time that Hamas uses civilians, okay, and that's why we have to bomb Gaza and so on. This is not true at all. There is no evidence that came from Israel or any international source.
The recent violence came after 3 Israeli teenagers were abducted and killed in the West Bank, and a Palestinian youth was then killed in apparent retaliation. As earlier peace talks failed, tonight a dramatic escalation, with news that Israeli forces have begun a ground offensive in Gaza.
There are a lot of people in Israel, both on the coalition and the opposition, who speaks about the need for a ground operation, because they say that until we uproot the Hamas terrorist infrastructure, it's going to go on again and again.
Israel, so far, from my point of view, isn't interested in ending its occupation of Palestinian land, isn't interested in recognizing Palestinian rights, and that's a major problem.
That report by Barry Cummins. Now joined from Tel Aviv by Paul Hirschson, a spokesperson for the Israeli Foreign Minister, and here in studio by Freda Hughes of the Ireland-Palestine Solidarity Campaign. Paul Hirschson, if I could go to you first. We've heard that the ground invasion has begun. How long? What is its aim? How long is it going to last? And how many more civilians are likely to die?
Tonight is a very sad moment, a point that we didn't want to reach. We didn't want to get called into this conflict in the first place. We went through 3 phases of ceasefire, including the day before yesterday, the Egyptian proposed ceasefire, which we adhered to, and the Hamas did not. Just today, the 5-hour United Nations proposed ceasefire, which we adhered to, and Hamas did not. We saw this morning a incursion of Hamas troops into Israel, which were repulsed by the Israeli military, and a brutal barrage of Israel by some 150 rockets in the hours this afternoon until the announcement. The Prime Minister has announced a ground operation whose goal is to deplete, to dismantle the terror tunnels. There's an entire infrastructure underneath the town, the city of Gaza, crossing the border into Israel, of tunnels out of which this military machine of Hamas is operating.
Well, we saw a statement tonight from the Israeli Defence Forces saying the IDF will continue its unprecedented effort to limit civilian harm. The effort may be unprecedented, but it's been remarkably unsuccessful because, according to the UN, 2/3 of those killed so far have been civilians, 20% of them children.
This is precisely the tragedy of being in this conflict that we didn't want to be in the first place. The tragedy which has been brought down on both sides of this conflict by Hamas. We didn't want to be here. We said for 3 weeks prior to this breaking out that calm will be met with calm. A message which was passed publicly and a message which was passed privately through diplomatic channels and rejected out of hand by Hamas. Just this evening, the government of Egypt has announced that they are holding Hamas responsible for the ground operation and for casualties on the side of the Palestinians. This we didn't want, but we have an obligation to protect the public in Israel. We face a stark threat of thousands of missiles. We estimate some 10,000 of missiles in the hands of Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, in the hands of people who have elevated suicide to a place in society which amounts to nothing less than the worship of death.
But at the same time, in anything like this, there has to be some sense of proportionality. And a lot of people are pointing to the fact that so far 1 Israeli has been killed by Hamas rocket attacks and something like 240 Palestinians. Now, you can't put a price on a human life, but it doesn't seem very proportionate.
Correct.
Well, it seems disproportionate in that the Israelis have killed far more.
Let me be clear, the Palestinian people are not our enemy, and we are doing everything we possibly can, and I think the international community is acknowledging that Israel is doing everything possible to avoid civilian casualties. But when you measure proportionality, the measurement of proportionality is against the threat that one faces, and we face a very stark threat of some significant weaponry in the hands of the darkest school of thought in modern political history. That is where the measurement of proportionality comes in.
But the evidence would suggest that you're not being very successful in avoiding civilian casualties. There have been far too many.
No, there have been some terrible tragedies, absolutely, and I don't want to belittle the death of any civilian. There have been many examples of Hamas using their civilians, using the population of Gaza as human shields, almost to the point of celebrating the death of their own civilians so that they can wage a public relations propaganda war against us. Okay. We're in a very complex, difficult situation. It's not for want of trying that Hamas has not wreaked havoc and death and destruction across pretty much all of the cities in Israel. Okay. On the way here to interview tonight at this studio, the sirens went off in Tel Aviv. I stopped my car on the side of the highway, got out of the car and lay down on the side of the road until it was clear for us to continue driving. Okay. This is a very complex situation which the government has an obligation to address.
Okay, if I could turn to Freda Hughes of the Ireland-Palestine Solidarity Campaign. As Paul was saying, a complex situation, but there is a simple element to it, which is that this situation would not have got this far if Hamas had stopped firing rockets into Israel.
Well, let's make something very clear to begin with. This is not a conflict of equals. And as various Israeli spokespeople will say, you know, they always pull out this kind of rigmarole that Hamas have started this by firing rockets. So let's put some context on this. This is an ongoing occupation. Gaza, while the settlers did leave in 2005. The illegal 8,000 settlers did leave. Gaza has been under siege, under blockade by land, sea and air ever since. Now that has completely restricted the freedom of movement. It has absolutely crippled the economy. It has led to a situation where if you want to fish, you have a very, very small amount that you... Okay, so to get into the...
I'm not going to dispute any of that.
So, okay, if we go back to Hamas and rockets, yes. I would like to, I suppose, look at how these questions are constantly framed in the media. To me, saying that Hamas have started this is completely wrong, okay? Under any occupation,
it doesn't matter who started
it is legal.
It doesn't matter who started it. If they keep firing rockets into Israel, Israel is going to respond.
Okay, so it doesn't matter who started. I'm afraid it does, okay? The rockets are being fired in response to Israel. Palestinians are defending themselves against an illegal and extremely oppressive occupying force. Under international law, the right to resistance, violent or non-violent, is legal under the Geneva Convention, the Fourth Geneva Convention of 1949. That is legal for any population under occupation. The right to resistance is legal. It's enshrined within international law and human rights. Now, of course, indiscriminate rocket fire is problematic because it's not targeting military targets only. It's indiscriminate. If we look at the disparity here again, this is not a conflict of equals. We look at the fourth biggest military power in the world, which is the Israeli Defence Force, against a strangled population of 1.8 million people in an area that's no bigger than the geographical area of Dublin County. Okay? Within that, you have some militant groups, some within Hamas, some other smaller militant groups. Their weaponry is very, very basic in comparison. You're looking at homemade Qassam rockets. And yes, there are some bigger, but nothing like the military might of the IDF. Now, it is the fourth biggest military power, as I've said. They have F-16s, F-18s. They have used illegal weapons like white phosphorus, as we saw in Operation Cast Lead, weapons which are illegal to use on a civilian population. So I think to frame that situation in that
well,
Israel
we also heard today from the UN Relief and Works Agency that they found 20 rockets being stored in a school that was vacant.
Yes,
and they said that that was completely against international law.
That is, of course, against international law, and there are war crimes on both sides here. But we have to look at the proportionality here, and Israel is in breach of international law before this assault and on an ongoing basis as part of its occupation. And with reference to the school, just to stress that that is the first time UNRWA have ever reported that.
Can I just go very quickly back to Paul in Tel Aviv? You're guilty of war crimes before this land incursion has even begun?
The Israeli military only targets legitimate military targets. And
so
the decision as to what a legitimate military target is through... The decision is taken through multiple layers of intelligence. It's accompanied the decision-making process by legal consultation, by judicial oversight, and significant training of the officers on the operational level. Let's be clear. War is an ugly place to be. I don't know if you've ever been in combat. It's a terrible place to be. It's an ugly place to be. And it's not a pure science. Civilians do get dragged into it. And this is precisely the reason why we didn't want to be here in the first place.
So, Paul, basically what you've said to me there is...
I'm afraid we've completely run out of time. But thank you both indeed very much for joining us.